January 17, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, ***. The jungle breathes in the darkness, thick, humid air clinging to skin like a second layer of cloth. Through the canopy, no stars penetrate. Only the occasional crack of a branch, the distant shriek of something unseen, and the rhythmic pulse of waves against volcanic sand. In a foxhole carved into the red clay hillside, a young Japanese Marine named Corporal Tanaka Yoshio grips his Arisaka rifle, the wood slick with moisture and sweat. His stomach has been empty for 3 days. The rice ration, when it came, was a handful, perhaps 4 ounces, mixed with weevils and the faint taste of mold. He does not complain. This is war. This is what soldiers endure. But something troubles him tonight, something beyond hunger and exhaustion. Across the ravine, perhaps 200 meters through the darkness, he hears them, the Americans. Not the sounds of retreat he was promised. Not the desperate scramble of defeated men fleeing toward their ships. Instead, he hears laughter. The metallic clank of mess kits. The low rumble of supply trucks grinding through mud. And beneath it all, carried on the night breeze, the unmistakable smell of cooked meat. Tanaka closes his eyes. In his mind, he sees the map they studied aboard the transport ship 6 months ago. Guadalcanal, a small island, barely worthy of notice. The operation would be swift, they were told. The Americans, soft from their years of peace and prosperity, would fold quickly. They lacked the warrior spirit, the Bushido code that made Japanese soldiers invincible. Within weeks, perhaps days, the enemy would withdraw, and the imperial flag would fly over Henderson Field. That was the promise. That was the certainty. Now, half a year later, Tanaka knows the promise was a lie. To understand how Tanaka arrived in this foxhole, starving and bewildered, one must step back to August 1942, when the first American Marines waded ashore at Red Beach. The invasion surprised Tokyo. Intelligence had underestimated American resolve, dismissed their industrial capacity, miscalculated their willingness to fight for a jungle island 6,000 miles from their homeland. The Japanese High Command responded with confidence bordering on arrogance. They would reinforce the island, crush the invaders, and secure the southern perimeter of their expanding empire. The men sent to accomplish this task were among the finest soldiers Japan could field, veterans of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, hardened by combat, indoctrinated in the belief that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. They were told the Americans were weak, that their multi-ethnic society bred cowardice, that their love of comfort made them unsuitable for jungle warfare. One captured Japanese document, recovered later by American intelligence, stated plainly, "The enemy lacks the spiritual strength to endure prolonged hardship. Our warrior spirit will prevail." But the Japanese strategists made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed logistics would favor the side with superior willpower. They believed that determination alone could overcome material disadvantage. They did not fully comprehend what they faced, not merely American Marines, but the entire industrial engine of a continental nation fully mobilized for war. The contrast became apparent within weeks. While Japanese reinforcements arrived by warship under cover of darkness, the famous Tokyo Express runs down the slot, their supply situation grew increasingly desperate. Ships carrying food and ammunition were diverted to carry more soldiers. The assumption was that the island's coconut palms and captured supplies would sustain the troops until victory. But Henderson Field, the airstrip both sides fought to control, remained in American hands, and with it came American air superiority. Japanese supply ships became targets. Those that made it through unloaded hastily before dawn, often jettisoning cargo into the surf to avoid morning air raids. The American supply situation could not have been more different. Every few days, Liberty ships arrived at Lunga Point, their holds crammed with everything an army needed. Not just ammunition and fuel, but food, mountains of it. Canned meat and vegetables, powdered eggs, coffee, chocolate bars, cigarettes. The Marines complained about the monotony of sea rations and spam, unaware that their enemy would have considered such meals a feast. American engineering battalions carved roads through the jungle, strung telephone lines, built warehouses with wooden floors to keep supplies dry. They erected field kitchens where cooks, actual trained cooks, not soldiers pressed into service, prepared hot meals 3 times daily. Japanese soldiers, watching from the jungle through binoculars, could scarcely believe what they witnessed. One Marine's diary, captured after a skirmish in October, contained a complaint about the breakfast eggs being too rubbery. Tanaka, reading this through an interpreter at regimental headquarters, felt something shift inside him, not anger, but a kind of vertigo, as if the ground beneath his certainties had suddenly become uncertain. By December, the disparity had become grotesque. Japanese soldiers were subsisting on what they called wild vegetables, a euphemism for grass, leaves, and roots that provided bulk but little nutrition. The official ration had been cut to less than half the minimum required for combat effectiveness. Beriberi and dysentery spread through the ranks. Men weakened to the point where they could barely lift their rifles. The jungle, which was supposed to be their ally, became an enemy more implacable than American firepower. Those who ventured to the coast in search of shellfish risked marine patrols. Those who remained in established positions slowly starved. The Americans, meanwhile, seemed to grow stronger. Reinforcements arrived not hollow-cheeked and exhausted, but fresh, well-fed. Carrying new equipment. Medical corpsmen moved freely behind the lines, treating wounds with sulfa drugs and real bandages, not the improvised dressings of torn cloth and hope that Japanese medics employed. American casualties were evacuated by ambulance to field hospitals with surgical tents, X-ray machines, and plasma. Japanese wounded often received a bullet to spare them the dishonor of capture, or were left where they fell, their cries gradually weakening into silence. The psychological impact of this material disparity cannot be overstated. Japanese military doctrine had prepared soldiers to endure suffering. It was central to their identity as warriors. But doctrine had not prepared them for the possibility that the enemy might not suffer at all. The American Marines fought hard, died bravely, and then rotated to rear areas where they ate hot food, received mail from home, and listened to jazz on portable radios powered by gasoline generators. On January 10, 1943, a Japanese patrol captured an American supply dump that had been hastily abandoned during a tactical withdrawal. What they found seemed like a hallucination born of hunger. Cases of canned peaches, stacked 6 feet high. Chocolate bars by the thousands. Cigarettes, American cigarettes, not the harsh Japanese issues they'd learned to despise. Coffee, real coffee, in quantities sufficient to supply a regiment for months. And meat, tinned beef, pork, even turkey. The patrol leader, a lieutenant named Oshiro, stood amid this abundance and wept. Not from joy, but from the crushing realization of what it meant. The Americans had abandoned more food in their retreat than the entire Japanese force on Guadalcanal had received in the past month. And they'd abandoned it casually, without desperation, because they knew more would arrive tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after. That the Americans could afford to be wasteful. They operated from a position of such overwhelming material superiority that individual supply dumps were disposable. Oshiro's men fell on the food like starving animals, which, in truth, they had become. They stuffed their pockets, their shirts, their packs. They ate until they vomited, their shrunken stomachs unable to process sudden richness. Then they ate more. The lieutenant tried to organize a proper inventory, to coordinate transport back to regimental headquarters, but discipline had evaporated in the face of plenty. Men who had shared the last grains of rice now fought over chocolate bars. When American artillery began falling on the position, they had never truly abandoned it, merely baited a trap. The Japanese soldiers hesitated, unwilling to leave the food. 7 men died clutching cans of peaches. Tanaka heard about the incident 3 days later. The story spread through the Japanese lines like a fever, embellished and distorted with each retelling. Some said the Americans had poisoned the food, an explanation more comforting than the truth. Others claimed it was a test of warrior spirit, that only the weak had succumbed to temptation. But Tanaka, sitting in his foxhole with his stomach cramping from hunger, understood the real message. They were losing not because they lacked courage, but because they had entered a different kind of war, one where industrial capacity mattered more than spiritual strength. The Americans didn't need to be better warriors. They only needed to feed their army while starving their enemy. This was not how war had been explained to him. At the Naval Academy in Yokosuka, instructors had lectured on the superiority of Japanese training and morale. They'd studied the Russo-Japanese War, where disciplined troops had overcome numerical disadvantage. They'd learned about the ancient samurai, who'd conquered with swords and spirit. But no one had prepared them for an enemy who treated war as an industrial problem, who solved tactical challenges with bulldozers and cargo ships, who measured victory not in territory captured but in tons of supplies delivered. The American way of war was alien to everything Tanaka had been taught. It lacked elegance. It seemed almost unfair, like bringing a machine gun to a sword fight. And yet it was undeniably effective. By mid-January, the Japanese High Command had reached its grim conclusion: Guadalcanal could not be held. The decision to evacuate was framed as a strategic redeployment, but the soldiers knew the truth. They were retreating because they could no longer sustain an army in the field. Not because they'd been outfought, though they had been, but because they'd been outsupplied to the point where further resistance was physically impossible. The evacuation operation, conducted over 3 nights in early February, was a masterpiece of military planning and courage. Destroyers slipped down the slot under cover of darkness, evacuated thousands of soldiers, and disappeared before dawn. American intelligence failed to detect the withdrawal until it was nearly complete. But even this tactical success couldn't disguise the strategic catastrophe. Of the roughly 36,000 Japanese soldiers sent to Guadalcanal, approximately 25,000 were evacuated. The rest, 11,000 men, had died not primarily from combat, but from starvation and disease. The Americans later found the jungle littered with corpses, many lying beside foxholes with unfired rifles, simply too weak to continue fighting. Tanaka was among those evacuated. Boarding the destroyer on the night of February 7th, he weighed perhaps 90 pounds, down from his deployment weight of 140. His uniform hung on his frame like a tent. His teeth were loose from scurvy. He could barely climb the rope ladder to the deck. A sailor, seeing his condition, offered him a rice ball. Real white rice, not the moldy gruel they'd been choking down for months. Tanaka took it with trembling hands and ate slowly, making each grain last, trying to remember what it felt like to not be hungry. As the destroyer's engines surged and the ship accelerated away from the island, Tanaka stood at the rail, looking back at the dark mass of jungle silhouetted against the stars. He thought about the foxhole he'd occupied for 6 months, the friends who would never leave the island, the absolute certainty with which they'd arrived and the bitter confusion with which they departed. And he thought about the Americans, still there, still eating their hot meals, still advancing. The symbolic weight of Guadalcanal extended far beyond its strategic value. The island itself was of marginal importance: a few thousand acres of jungle, a primitive airstrip, a handful of coconut plantations. But what happened there shattered fundamental assumptions about how the Pacific War would unfold. The Japanese military had predicated its entire strategy on the belief that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that Asian soldiers possessed superior warrior culture, that Western democracies, soft, decadent, obsessed with individual comfort, would falter when confronted with determined resistance. Guadalcanal proved these assumptions catastrophically wrong. The Americans had fought with just as much courage and determination as their enemy, but they'd fought from a foundation of overwhelming logistical superiority. They'd built an industrial warfare machine so powerful that it could sustain armies on the far side of the Pacific while simultaneously feeding and equipping another army fighting across North Africa and preparing for the invasion of Europe. This was warfare on a scale that Japanese planners had failed to comprehend. Consider the mathematics. During the 6-month campaign, American forces on Guadalcanal consumed an average of 8 pounds of supplies per man. Per day: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, construction materials, spare parts. For a force that grew to 60,000 men, this meant importing nearly 500 tons of material daily. Over 6 months, That's 90,000 tons of supplies delivered to a hostile island 6,000 miles from the American mainland. The Japanese managed to deliver perhaps 1/10 of that amount to their forces. This disparity wasn't accidental. It reflected the fundamental difference between an industrialized democracy with a continental resource base and an island empire stretched to the breaking point. The United States in 1943 was producing more steel than all other combatant nations combined. Its factories were churning out ships, planes, tanks, and weapons at rates that seemed impossible to observers schooled in traditional military economics. Liberty's ships were being built in weeks, not months. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt had called it, was operating at full capacity. But the material advantages, staggering as they were, don't fully explain the psychological impact. What broke Japanese morale on Guadalcanal wasn't simply that they were outgunned and outnumbered, but that they came to understand the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict. They could win individual battles, and they did, inflicting heavy casualties in actions like the Battle of the Tenaru and the fierce fighting for Edson's Ridge. But they couldn't win the war of attrition, because the Americans had infinite depth. A Japanese soldier killed could not be easily replaced. His rifle, his equipment, his training, all represented scarce resources. An American soldier killed was mourned, honored, and then replaced by another fresh recruit from a population of 135 million, equipped with new gear from factories that never stopped running. The Japanese lost ships they couldn't replace. The Americans lost ships and built 2 more. The contrast was visible in every aspect of the campaign, from the quality of field rations to the sophistication of medical care to the simple fact that American soldiers carried abundant ammunition, while Japanese soldiers hoarded every round. This material superiority also enabled a different approach to casualties. American doctrine emphasized preserving soldiers' lives through overwhelming firepower and careful planning. Rather than rely on banzai charges and suicidal determination, American commanders called in artillery, naval gunfire, and air strikes. Why sacrifice men when you can expend shells? This pragmatic, almost industrial approach to warfare horrified Japanese observers who viewed such tactics as cowardly. Real warriors closed with the enemy, accepted death as a possibility, even welcomed it. But efficiency triumphed over romanticism. By war's end, the casualty ratios told the story. For every American killed, several Japanese soldiers died. Not because Americans were better fighters in some abstract sense, but because they fought smarter, backed by resources their enemy couldn't match. The psychological transformation this wrought in soldiers like Tanaka was profound and lasting. They had embarked on the campaign as true believers in Japanese superiority, convinced that history was on their side, that the co-prosperity sphere represented Asia's destiny. They returned, those who returned, as hollow men, their certainties shattered. The Americans they'd been told to despise had proven not only courageous but terrifyingly competent. More disturbing still, the Americans had revealed that modern war was not a test of spiritual strength but an industrial process, and Japan was on the wrong side of the equation. In the months and years that followed, this lesson would be driven home with increasing brutality. Every island battle followed the same pattern: Japanese forces, cut off from resupply, fighting to the death as American material superiority ground them down. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each campaign demonstrated the same fundamental dynamic. The Japanese could inflict casualties. They could make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of ground. But they couldn't win, because winning required sustaining an army in the field, and that required a supply system they simply didn't possess. The symbolism of food, that simple, primal need, haunted Japanese veterans for the rest of their lives. Tanaka, who survived the war and lived into his 80s, never forgot the smell of American cooking drifting across the ravine, the sight of that abandoned supply dump, the crushing realization that the enemy ate better in the middle of a combat zone than he'd eaten at peacetime barracks. In interviews conducted decades later, Japanese Guadalcanal veterans consistently returned to this theme, not the horror of combat, which they'd been prepared for, but the psychological devastation of understanding they'd been sent to fight an enemy who operated from a position of such overwhelming abundance that they discarded food their enemy would have killed for. The evacuation of Guadalcanal marked the high water mark of Japanese expansion. After February 1943, every military operation conducted by imperial forces was defensive, a fighting retreat across the Pacific. Tokyo's propaganda machine tried to spin the withdrawal as a tactical victory, a brilliant strategic maneuver. But the soldiers knew. The civilians would know soon enough. Japan had entered a war it couldn't win, against an enemy it had fundamentally misunderstood. The Americans weren't soft. They weren't weak. They weren't lacking in fighting spirit. They simply fought differently, approaching war as an engineering challenge to be solved with resources and organization. They built roads where the Japanese hacked trails. They erected field hospitals where the Japanese dug mass graves. They fed their soldiers 3 hot meals a day while their enemy foraged for roots and grass. And when the fighting was done, when the last shot had been fired and the last position overrun, the Americans walked away leaving behind more material than entire Japanese armies possessed. This was the lesson of Guadalcanal, though it took years for its full implications to sink in. Japan had picked a fight with an enemy whose industrial capacity was so vast, whose organizational prowess so sophisticated, whose willingness to apply resources to military problems so absolute, that victory was never truly possible. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had bought time and tactical advantage, but it had also awakened a giant that, once fully mobilized, proved unstoppable. On February 8, 1943, the destroyer carrying Tanaka docked at Shortland Harbor. The evacuated soldiers stumbled ashore, skeletal figures in tattered uniforms, many unable to walk without assistance. They were fed, given medical attention, and eventually reassigned to other units, other campaigns. Tanaka would fight again, on Saipan in 1944, where he was seriously wounded and sent home to Japan. But he would never again believe in the propaganda, never again trust the assurances of easy victory. Guadalcanal had taught him that war was not a test of spiritual purity but a brutal calculus of resources and will, and Japan had entered the equation with insufficient numbers. In the decades after the war, historians would analyze Guadalcanal through various lenses: strategic turning point, naval innovation, amphibious warfare precedent. All these interpretations carry truth. But for the men who fought there, particularly those on the losing side, the campaign represented something more fundamental: the collision of 2 worldviews, 2 approaches to warfare, 2 visions of how nations fight and why they win. The Japanese vision emphasized willpower, sacrifice, and spiritual strength. It was rooted in centuries of warrior tradition, in the samurai code, in the belief that discipline and determination could overcome material disadvantage. This vision was beautiful in its way, romantic and compelling. It inspired acts of extraordinary courage. But on Guadalcanal, it collided with a different vision, one that emphasized industrial production, logistical efficiency, and the application of overwhelming force. This vision was less romantic, more pragmatic. It treated war as a problem to be solved through organization and resources. And on Guadalcanal, as across the Pacific, the pragmatic vision prevailed. The symbolic object that bound this narrative together was not a weapon, not a flag, but something more mundane and more powerful: a can of food. Specifically, a can of American beef, the kind that arrived by the thousands in every supply ship, that American soldiers opened casually, and sometimes didn't finish, that Japanese soldiers would find in abandoned positions and clutch like religious relics. This simple can represented the entire gulf between the combatants: American abundance versus Japanese deprivation, industrial might versus spiritual determination, the future of warfare versus its past. When Tanaka finally returned to Japan in late 1944, he carried in his pack a single item he'd salvaged from Guadalcanal: an empty can of Spam, its label faded but still readable. He kept it on a shelf in his home for the rest of his life. Visitors would ask about it sometimes, and he would tell them it came from the war, but he never fully explained what it meant to him. How could he explain that this battered can represented the moment his certainties died, when he understood that courage and determination weren't enough, that modern war demanded resources his country couldn't provide. How could he explain that the Americans had won not by fighting better, but by feeding their soldiers while his army starved? The epilogue to the Guadalcanal campaign unfolded across the next 2.5 years, as the pattern established on that jungle island repeated itself across the Pacific. Each battle became a variation on the same theme: Japanese forces, isolated and undersupplied, fighting to the death against an enemy that grew stronger with each passing month. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and inexorable. By August 1945, when the atomic bombs fell and Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio announcing surrender, Japan's military had been reduced to hollow formations, armies without ammunition, air forces without fuel, a navy sunk or rusting in port. The soldiers who survived Guadalcanal carried its lessons to the end. They knew, even if their commanders refused to acknowledge it, that the war had been lost on that jungle island when they realized the Americans would never retreat, never falter, never run short of supplies. They'd learned that the modern world belonged to industrial democracies capable of projecting power across oceans, of sustaining armies on distant shores, of treating warfare as an organizational challenge to be solved with railways and cargo ships and canned beef. In the years after the war, Japan rebuilt itself along different principles. The warrior ethos that had dominated military thinking gave way to industrial development and economic growth. The same organizational talent that had once gone into planning naval battles now focused on manufacturing cars and electronics. In a strange way, Japan became what it had fought against, an industrial power that measured success not in territory conquered but in goods produced, a nation that channeled its competitive energy into markets rather than battlefields. And somewhere in suburban Tokyo, in a small house with a neat garden, an old man named Tanaka kept a rusted ken on his shelf. A reminder of the moment when the old world ended and the new one began, when he learned that armies march on their stomachs, that logistics defeats valor, that the future belongs not to those who fight hardest but to those who supply best. The deeper truth of Guadalcanal extends beyond military history into questions of political economy and social organization. Why could America project such overwhelming power? The answer lies not merely in natural resources, though those mattered, but in the structure of democratic industrial capitalism. A system that encouraged innovation, rewarded efficiency, channeled competition into productive enterprise, and mobilized entire populations in support of national goals. This system, which Japanese militarists had viewed as decadent and weak, proved capable of extraordinary feats when fully mobilized. The irony is that Japanese leaders had partially understood this reality. Admiral Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, had studied in America and knew its industrial capacity. He'd famously warned that Japan might run wild for 6 months or a year, but couldn't win a prolonged war against American production. His prediction was precisely accurate. But the militarists who controlled Japanese policy couldn't accept this conclusion, because it meant acknowledging that warfare had fundamentally changed, that spiritual strength and warrior tradition weren't sufficient, that modern war demanded industrial might. Guadalcanal was where this truth became undeniable. In the jungle night, when Japanese soldiers heard American laughter and smelled American food, when they watched supply ships arrive while their own stomachs cramped with hunger, the abstract arguments about industrial capacity became concrete and personal. They were losing not because they lacked courage, they had proven their bravery beyond question, but because they fought for a system that couldn't feed them, couldn't equip them, couldn't sustain them in the field. This is the final, hardest lesson, that righteousness and determination aren't enough if the material foundations are insufficient. That belief, however strong, cannot substitute for supply lines. That tradition, however venerable, cannot compete with innovation. The American Marines on Guadalcanal weren't inherently superior as individual warriors, though they fought magnificently, but they represented a superior system, one that treated warfare as a problem to be solved through organization and resources rather than a test to be passed through willpower alone. In the end, Guadalcanal matters not because it was the largest battle or the bloodiest campaign, but because it revealed fundamental truths about modern warfare that would shape the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. It demonstrated that industrial democracies, when fully mobilized, could project devastating power across the globe. It showed that logistics and supply chains were as important as tactics and courage. It proved that abundance was itself a weapon, that the ability to feed and equip an army determined victory as much as the ability to fight. For the Japanese soldiers who experienced this revelation firsthand, who starved in their foxholes while their enemy ate hot meals, who fought without ammunition while their enemy expended it lavishly, the lesson was shattering. They had been sent to conquer based on assurances of superiority that proved hollow. They had believed in their nation's special destiny, in the warrior spirit that made them invincible, in the weakness of democratic societies. Guadalcanal destroyed these beliefs not through propaganda but through the grinding reality of empty stomachs and full American supply dumps. And so we returned to that January night, to Corporal Tanaka in his foxhole, listening to American laughter drift across the ravine, smelling meat cooking while his own rations had run out days before. In that moment, cold and hungry and beginning to understand, he glimpsed the future, not just of this campaign or this war, but of the century to come. A future where industrial might mattered more than martial tradition, where abundance trumped austerity, where the nations that could feed their armies would defeat those that could only exhort them to endure. The can of Spam on his shelf was his silent witness, his reminder that wars are won not in the heart alone but in the factories and the supply depots and the cargo holds of ships that cross vast oceans bearing not just weapons but food, endless, abundant, casually discarded food. This was America's truest weapon, the one that Japanese doctrine had no counter for, the ability to fight without wanting, to wage war without sacrifice, to project power without deprivation. On Guadalcanal, in the space between one foxhole and another, between hunger and satiety, between tradition and modernity, the outcome of the Pacific War became inevitable. The only question was how long it would take for everyone to accept what Tanaka had learned on a dark January night, that in the modern world, the side that can feed its soldiers will always defeat the side that cannot, that abundance is destiny, and that the warrior spirit, no matter how pure, cannot sustain an army when the supply ships stop coming. The jungle holds its secrets still. Rusted weapons, bleached bones, the ghosts of 25,000 men who learned these lessons too late. But the lessons themselves endure, carved not in monuments but in the memories of men like Tanaka, who carried their understanding forward into a world rebuilt on different principles, where the measure of a nation was not its warriors but its factories, not its tradition but its productivity, not its willingness to sacrifice but its capacity to provide. This was the gift and the curse of Guadalcanal. Clarity. Terrible, undeniable clarity about what kind of war this was, and who had the means to win it.